What makes war economies a magnet for criminal activity? Can campaigns to regulate the economic dimensions of armed conflict and hold powerful corporations to account achieve meaningful results? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute's interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Mark Taylor. Mark Taylor is a researcher and investigator whose work is focused on business and human rights. For 2 decades, he has investigated the legal regulation of global value chains, in particular, the role of strategic litigation in the fields of human rights and climate action. He has held research and management positions at the FAFO Institute for Labor and Social Research and at the University of Oslo. He's advised governments, civil society, trade unions, and companies on the theory and practice of responsible business. His most recent publication, out this year from Cambridge University Press, is War Economies and International Law, Regulating the Economic Activities of Violent Conflict. Mark Taylor, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's very kind of you to invite me, Maureen.
Thank you for being here, Mark. I'd like to start by asking you, in your new book, War Economies and International Law, you identify the combination of violence and economic opportunity as the core pathology of war economies, to quote you directly. With this in mind, what distinguishes war economies from economic activity during times of armed conflict?
I think that we tend to use the term war economies to cover both, but the core element here of a war economy is that it's servicing the actors in the conflict zone, right? And so we tend to think about war economies, for example, in the industrial sense, as being the defense industry, the military-industrial complex, as it is often called. But in the conflict zone, war economies have a different meaning. They do some of the same things. They service the parties to the conflict, whether those are armed groups or state militias or state militaries. But they also are crucial for the survival of people living in the war zone. And really, in the book, what I'm trying to do is to get some of the international lawyers to think about these two functions more strategically in how we think about law that's applied to war.
Mm. And you describe war economies as organic systems, like you just said, that extend far beyond the activities of warlords and arms dealers. At the same time, you note that as a rule, economic factors neither cause nor resolve armed conflicts. That said, give us an indication of the various dimensions through which economic factors penetrate armed conflicts.
I think the best way to think about this is in relation to kind of the 3 key components of war economies, namely the labor that you need to fight a war, the money you need to finance it, whether it's to pay salaries or to buy the third element, which is, of course, weapons. And if you use and play with those concepts, the way those are obtained and produced in these different settings, both formal and informal, both very, very local and very, very global. But if you play with those 3 core factors of production, if you will, then I think you actually can help it helps to understand these often very different and very local manifestations of these war economies. The other thing to keep in mind here is that, in particular, over the last 40 years of neoliberal, lowering of trade barriers and global trade integration, financialization of trade relationships as well, and of capitalism in general. What you see in these war zones is that they're very well integrated to global value chains. So whether it's through commodities leaving the war zone in the form of conflict minerals, probably being the more famous, but everything from antiquities to, of course, people being trafficked, as well as commodities passing into the war zone or through war zones, or recirculating in war zones, and the big one there being, of course, weapons. But money is really crucial here, and of course it has long been, going back thousands of years, the Greeks referred to money as the sinews of war. There's lots of quotes when you start to dig through the philosophical literature with respect to war, and of course this is sort of all very old. There's nothing particularly new about this, which is also kind of surprising that we haven't really thought about it in the ways that we really should have, in particular with respect to international law.
Well, maybe you can give us a real world example of what you've just been describing. You mentioned conflict minerals, human trafficking, and so on. But could you give us a real world example which illustrates kind of the dynamics between the local and the global, the financing and the fighting?
Right, sure. The key here is that the guys with the guns are going to be controlling access to economic opportunity on the ground. And so you pick your war zone, you will find different commodities that are being controlled, people being taxed, whether it's at a checkpoint, for example, whether it's a company whose factory is being, the access is being controlled to the factory, or the factory is being supplied through deals being done with armed groups in the area. Pick your conflict zone, you will find these dynamics ongoing. And so it's different from place to place. But what happens is that people will find a way to survive, of course. And armed groups, both state and non-state armed groups, will find ways to prey on those people. So even if you do things like shut down supplies of conflict diamonds from a particular area, or go after the artisanal refining of oil by IS in Syria back in 2014, 2015, even if you go after those types of sources, and you may succeed in degrading their ability to make money, but they're going to find other ways. They're going to find other resources to exploit. And so this has big implications for how we think about things like sanctions, for example, or how we think about economic warfare in general.
Mark, you write that the economic dimensions of war have been hiding in plain sight of those responsible for regulating and resolving armed conflicts. Given the organic relationship between warfare, power, and money, as you've been describing, what accounts for this historical blind spot? Is it because these types of activities that you've been investigating have traditionally been considered legitimate? Is that the reason they've been off the agenda for so many centuries?
I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, if you look at the entire colonial enterprise, to the extent at which, at the same time as you're in European international law, they were developing rules against pillage and plunder, and at the same time, of course, mercantilist companies and armies were busy pillaging and plundering in the developing world in the 18th and 19th century and through to the 20th century. I think that there's a blind spot in the law, in part because of that history. I mean, the colonial enterprise, you see, it gets carved out as a real sort of exception within the law to allow
legitimate plunder and pillage.
Yeah, as a form of legitimate plunder and pillage, and of course as a form of legitimate enslavement. So even as you in Europe, post-Enlightenment, see this transition towards kind of liberal values within market-based economies. At the same time, you're seeing and that's a very real shift that happens post-Enlightenment. It's a move away from war in Europe, which was basically understood as a form of acquisitive activity. I mean, the whole point of war was to take territory, take populations, and tax the hell out of them, right? That was the point. But with the Enlightenment, you see a shift in norms, and of course that coincides with the transition to a state-based system, the sort of post-Westphalian state-based system. And there's a couple of things that happen around that time, and crucial here is, of course, industrialization. It's no longer necessary or even profitable to be waging war on a kind of plunder-based system when you have when really what you need is industrial capacity and the natural resources for driving that industrial capacity. And the other thing that happens, and is a fascinating bit of this history, is that whereas in pre-modern era there were all kinds of kind of non-state actors in the international system that were manifestations of these economies of war. Think of mercenaries, mercantilist companies, pirates, and privateers. And what happens over the 18th and 19th century is that these become, and just the practice of pillage as well, these become increasingly outlawed until they're outright outlawed by the middle of the 19th century. And so states are busy asserting, right, their monopoly on coercion in the international system. So this whole complex transition that happens over about 200 years, especially for the international lawyers, I think, left us with a blind spot, which is that, you know, the economic dimensions aren't actually stuff we deal with, especially the humanitarian lawyers. When you look at the early humanitarian lawyers, you know, the guys who were writing the original laws of war around in the late 19th century in Switzerland and Oxford and The Hague and elsewhere, they're also writing about the protection of property rights. When you look at one of the first military codes in the sort of modern canon of laws in war, the Lieber Code in the United States, almost everywhere you see protections for people, and of course the banning of slavery, etc. You also see the protection of property rights. And so there's this, I think because of this, there's a kind of an assumption that because we've ruled it out, it doesn't really exist. It's not really happening. And of course, that's nice for us lawyers to think about, but it's not actually what's happening on the ground. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to draw on, and this is kind of the final point about this blind spot, is to draw on the social science of the last 20 years, especially in sociology and anthropology of conflict and conflict zones, which has kind of brought the social relations within war zones, made them more visible, made it possible to talk about them in an empirical way, and enabled me, for example, to try to describe what this looks like across, in a generalized way, across different conflict zones, and say, look, this is a thing. War economies are actually a thing, and we should be thinking about them as international lawyers as we try to regulate both the violence of conflict, but also as we try to think about how to make peace and what actually peace, you know, can look like. We need to take those economic structures into consideration.
So if I just picking up on what you just said, if I understand correctly, there were basically two issues. The first is that by simply asserting the protection of property, it was assumed unnecessary to regulate how this would, to regulate the economic factors of warfare. And the second is that there was kind of a colonialist exception where states were primarily concerned with how they waged war against each other, but outside kind of the system of established states, primarily in Western Europe, where many of these regulations rather were developed, it was considered a free-for-all around the seven seas. Is that how I should
Absolutely, understand? Absolutely. And you see recurring, I mean, there's ways in which the pre-modern patterns, you know, reassert themselves, including in Europe. I mean, in many ways, you know, Napoleon was famous for saying that his army, you know, fought on its stomach. You know, they lived off the territory that they conquered, but that was actually a shock to the system, at least to the normative system in sort of Enlightenment Europe, right? Meanwhile, there's a race going on for Africa and the Middle East and the East, that they're all busy competing in.
Right. Again, trying to draw on your recent book, and also your other research, it seems that there are currently two interrelated developments with respect to the economic aspects of armed conflict. One is the growth of efforts to formally regulate economic activity during armed conflict. The other consists of campaigns, often by activists, to hold those profiting from armed conflict to account. Would it be accurate to state that the regulatory developments are primarily concerned with the activities of parties directly involved in armed conflict, whereas the campaigns are more focused on outside parties whose activities are prolonging such conflicts and intensifying the suffering involved?
That's probably fair. I would say that there's kind of the two drivers until now, and I think there's probably variance on this in the last 4 or 5 years. But one is this concern on the part, a kind of normative concern on the part of, let's call it, human rights campaigners and others, environmental campaigners and others, that demand in major markets, whether that's in Europe, North America, China, and elsewhere, is driving activities on the ground, including in war zones. So you're seeing extraction and forced labor, for example, happening in these war zones that is actually connected into and providing inputs to global value chains. And that if we want to do the right thing and somehow bring peace to these places, we might want to start with our own involvement in those activities. And I mean, the examples of this, I've talked about the commodities, but the conflict issue, the conflict minerals type commodities, which go into electronics coming out of Africa. But there's also other ways in which we help to sustain these conflicts. There's a company right now in Denmark that has been prosecuted for supplying jet fuel to the Russian military in Syria in violation of EU sanctions. The prosecution was for having provided that fuel in violation of EU sanctions. And given what we know about the patterns of Russian bombing in Syria, one could argue that there was a pretty clear case of corporate complicity in crimes being committed, but by attacks on civilians, by those airstrikes. Lots of concerns have been raised about that. But this company didn't really seem to think it was a problem, despite the fact that this was being debated at the Security Council. There was all kinds of public attention to it, but they simply got on with business. So there's an increasing focus by the human rights community around these kinds of activities, and that has been true now, I think, probably going on at least 20 years. Part of the overall movement towards
corporate social responsibility, as it's
corporate social responsibility, then business human rights, corporate accountability, and one part of that, one small slice of that, is actually looking at corporate accountability in relation to international crimes and war. And we can come back to that, but I just want to mention one of the other driving force here, which is economic warfare, and by that I mean economic warfare by states targeting threats and or enemies as they do so. And the primary tool has been the use of sanctions. And there's two really interesting developments, I think, in this in recent years. One is that the sanctions tool, which, if you think about it, has only really been around in its kind of present legal form for about a quarter of a century, 25 years or so. I mean, the UN sanctions really didn't start to bite.
Starting with Iraq after it invaded Kuwait.
For example, I mean, you have to go back to the 60s to find the first instance of UN sanctions. Of course, the US sanctions and more recently EU sanctions are much more. The US does a lot of sanctioning, but the scale and the level and the expansive use of these sanctions is relatively recent, in the longer historical perspective.
Seems to have replaced siege warfare in many respects.
They are, exactly. They are, in fact, a form of siege warfare. And so it's really important to understand them as such, because of these two things that are happening right now. One is that you're seeing a sort of almost, since Trump in particular, this kind of neo-mercantilist approach to foreign policy, right? Where it's, in the case of Syria, he was all about going and getting the oil, right? Which of course the Pentagon was kind of like, well, wait a minute, yeah, but not really, and we'll talk about it a different way, and what you're seeing, of course, is this kind of geopolitical competition starts to drive the attempts to exclude your competitors from your value chains, right? Which of course is the polar opposite of what we lived through for the last 30 or 40 years, which was increasing global integration, bringing the Chinese in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But now we're in this world in which we have to exclude Huawei, from our telephone systems, and national security imposing restrictions, in particular in the area of tech. And that's both new and not new. It's not new because that's exactly what we did throughout the Cold War.
Right.
Okay, we consistently, there was a committee that sat in Paris with the Western allies that made sure we weren't doing technological deals that would give technology to the Warsaw Pact countries, the USSR and its allies. But it's new because we've lived through 30 or 40 years of global integration, and now all of a sudden global trade integration, and now all of a sudden we're running up against this wall of national security in a big way. The other thing, and this is, I think, connecting with this drive for increasingly normative human rights approaches to global trade, putting human rights into global trade agreements, labor rights into government procurement policies when they buy, and making demands of global companies that they meet certain human rights and sustainability standards. And this dynamic is extremely interesting because it's happening as we speak, and the war economies part really sort of, I think it's fascinating because it kind of combines all of this, It has this national security component, it has this normative human rights component. When you look at, for example, Magnitsky sanctions, where you're taking human rights and you're enforcing them with sanctions, you're taking siege warfare tactics, right? You're taking siege warfare tactics, but you're enforcing it with respect to sanctions. And I think in particular for the left, and for people who are concerned about foreign policy and the impacts that we have in the West on the rest of the world, this debate around sanctions is really a crucial one to be having, and we're not having it in anything like the nuance that we need to be having it.
Well, I'd like to pick up on that because you mentioned corporate accountability. But the examples you gave of Huawei and the Magnitsky Act, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, are actions by states and governments. And I think when many people consider the question of corporate accountability, they see a group of relatively powerless activists seeking to take on multinational corporations that are often more powerful than any number of states combined. With this in mind, can you give an example where attempts to hold a major international corporation for its participation in criminal activity during armed conflict has actually been successful?
There has never been such a case where a company, in other words, a legal person, a corporation, has been prosecuted for its involvement in war crimes. At the end of the Second World War, you saw trials of the Nazi industrialists and Japanese industrialists for things like slavery and forced labor, for pillage, for the plundering of both business enterprises in parts of Europe when the Nazis occupied, when the Germans occupied parts of Europe, as well as Jewish property, and for complicity also in the death camps. Now,
sorry, but again, these were prosecutions by states.
These were prosecutions by states of individuals. But I mean, keep in mind here, you're not going to get criminal prosecutions by anybody else but states, right? I mean, it is states that prosecute criminally. So there's a whole other area of the law which has to do with civil litigation, lawsuits, which have proceeded on issues of, for example, slavery, forced labor, those sorts of things, especially in common law jurisdictions like the United States, UK, Canada to a certain extent, a couple of other places. In the civil law jurisdictions, the continental systems in Europe, you see a number of cases where there are both corporations and individual business people who are being attempted to being prosecuted for their participation in international crimes. So, for example, there's probably been, I think, 3 cases where individual business people have actually been convicted of their participation in international crimes, twice in the Netherlands and once in Argentina. And in those cases, in one of the cases in the Netherlands involved a prosecution of a businessman named Frans van Anraat, who was convicted of having provided chemical precursors to the regime of Saddam Hussein that was then used in his war against Iran and against the Kurds. So this is by no means kind of, to come back to your question, this is by no means a kind of successful area of the law, right? In particular in holding corporations to account. Nonetheless, there's an increasing number of cases. There are cases ongoing as we speak. Just a few weeks ago, a Swedish prosecutor indicted a Swedish oil company for its alleged involvement in war crimes committed by the government of Sudan during the civil war back between 1999 and 2003. There's a case proceeding in France of a large cement company for its payments to ISIS in Syria.
Yeah,
right?
That's been going on for several years, I believe now.
That's right. All of these cases have been going on for several years in one way or another, either because they're being investigated or because they're proceeding in courts. But there's probably over the last 10 years, there's probably been another 10 or 11 cases. Some of them are ongoing now. Some of them were dismissed. And so, it's a field in which until 2005, really, between 2005 and the end of the Second World War, there had been no cases. Right. So in the last 15 years, we've seen sort of 10 or 12 that have come up.
Let me then approach this question from a somewhat different angle, because at the end of the day, I think the overall theme of your book is not so much that criminals need to be held to account, although that's certainly an important point you make. But I think your main point is that there needs to be further development of international law in order, as we were discussing earlier, to regulate activities that have been a historical blind spot. Now, with that in mind, have there been, in your view, significant regulatory developments in international law in the past decade or two that you believe is a foundation on which these kinds of activities can be more successfully confronted?
I think where the most activity is happening in this regard is in the sanctions space. It's important to keep in mind that when we're talking about regulating war economies, in particular, when we're talking about the kinds of activity that are happening on the ground, that the only way you successfully regulate a space that is by definition unregulated, right? I mean, the state is, to a certain extent, in these war zones, the whole point is that political authority is contested, right? I mean, if it's a civil war or an insurgency, or one state has invaded another, there is this contested space. So, the domestic law is not being applied. So how does the international community regulate there? And I think one of the most interesting examples, both positively and negatively, is what the Obama administration tried to do to isolate the IS economy, to isolate the economy of the Islamic State. Because the famous stuff was, of course, bombing the oil fields and trying to reduce their capacity to trade in oil.
And this was primarily bombing convoys exporting oil from
Yes, and
fields to Turkey.
bombing convoys that were exporting to Iraq and to Turkey, but also to the regime.
Mm-hmm.
There were cross-conflict deals being done between ISIS-controlled oil fields and the regime, just as there are deals being done today, actually, more so now, in fact, between Kurdish and US-controlled oil fields in the east of Syria and the regime. Those are above board. The IS deals, of course, were all below the table. But but the interesting part about that was not the bombing, in my view. The interesting part about that, as an example, was in fact the diplomatic effort that the Obama administration tried to make to actually rally the number of European states and, crucially, the border states, Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the surrounding, to try to get to grips with the flows that were moving in and out of what was an extremely porous war zone. And so that's kind of one example of this kind of a practical attempt. And to my knowledge, it's probably one of the few examples of a sort of, it's almost a classic old style, trying to put a cordon sanitaire, to really try to shut a place off, right? It's really one of the first times I've ever seen that happening. When you look at what the UN did in Central Africa or West Africa, in the case of DRC, or West Africa in the 1990s and so on.
Liberia and Sierra Leone.
Liberia, Sierra Leone. It's been very much patchwork and trying to build the capacity of the state to regulate, right? So not trying to replace the state, but trying to get the state to take responsibility for controlling its borders, et cetera, which has been in some ways is the obvious way to go, but in other ways has been really problematic.
Well, I'd like to now turn to the Middle East. You were just discussing the example of oil exports by the Islamic State movement. But if we talk about war economies and criminal activity in the Middle East, or rather war economies and how the elements of this discussion relate to the Middle East, you've of course got conflicts in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria, occupations in Palestine and Western Sahara, and probably the most severe and murderous sanctions regime and arguably all of human history, which was Iraq during the 1990s. And now, and in addition, you have Iran, which has been under various forms of sanctions, I believe, since the late 1970s. So how do these elements and the objectives of your research relate to the Middle East? Because you have this patchwork of not just states, and I should have mentioned Sudan in this respect as well, of not just individual states sanctioning their adversaries, but of almost, the entire international system being mobilized to punish entire populations, while at the same time, I think you have this very interesting dynamic of states, non-state actors, militias, transnational movements, and the rest of it.
So there's a couple of things I would say about this. One is to go back to that notion of siege warfare, where, for example, in Syria, we saw siege warfare be very much at the heart of the regime's conduct of the war, right? And there's, I mentioned that the sort of Obama era effort was an attempt a way to go after IS in a similar way, but on a larger scale, to kind of isolate and shut them off. The example, of course, that I haven't mentioned so far, and which is probably the most successful in terms of doing what Obama tried to do is, of course, the Israeli control of, in particular, Gaza, but also the Palestinian territories, where closure and siege has been absolutely central for several decades in attempting to control the Palestinian population in Gaza and the West Bank. So these things are happening throughout the Middle East in different ways, and when you kind of come and they are, I think, those kinds of examples are the ways in which siege warfare is at its most effective. You can't control a war zone through sanctions, right? All you do with the kinds of sanctions imposed on, for example, Iraq in the 1990s, is that you impoverish the population and you strengthen those who already have the means to run rat lines around the sanctions, right?
And I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mark, but would it be fair to say that sanctions tend to privilege those who already hold power?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think there's any question about that. One of the things that we don't talk enough about when we talk about sanctions is the extent to which the kinds of sanctions we're imagining aren't really used anymore. So the kinds of sanctions that were imposed in Iraq, the kinds of sanctions that have a logic of attempting to break the population and or attempting to cause the population to rise up in some imaginary
never happens
causal chain that I still to this day don't understand how they came up with that. Those actually aren't the predominant forms of sanctions that we're dealing with when we're talking about the sort of war economy stuff. What we're talking about are targeted sanctions, right? That go after particular individuals, usually those individuals close to the regime. And the debate that I think we need to be having, and which I was unable to get into in this book because the book is really a broad stroke across a bunch of different areas of international law. But I think that the debate I'm missing, let me put it that way, is how do we actually grapple with the fact that as a tool of foreign policy, sanctions can be used to go after precisely those people that you just mentioned, right? You can actually isolate the oligarch who is busy making money off a sanctions regime that is, penalizing the general population. You can actually target that person. You can target the person who is benefiting from making chemical weapons for the regime, or barrel bombs for the regime, right? There are ways in which the kinds of tools that we would imagine, or the kinds of actions we would imagine going after, if we were trying to do the right thing or try to come up with a progressive foreign policy, we'd end up with looking very hard at sanctions. And I don't think there's anywhere near enough debate about how we could even imagine doing that progressively. I would argue we're nowhere near that right now in terms of the practice. But when you think through, when you look at war economies, when you look at the way that authoritarian regimes control access to opportunity within their borders and in cahoots with their fellows in other regimes in the region, and this goes particularly for the Middle East, you very quickly start to realize, well, okay, these guys actually, they own a lot of property in London and Paris and Berlin, Geneva, and elsewhere. Maybe they shouldn't. Okay, well, how do we stop them? How do we undermine their ability to move money?
And of course, this has two dimensions. The first is the ill-begotten gains, if you will, yeah. And the second is a government like that in the UK that has decided that more or less advertising itself as the money laundering capital of the world, right, is very good for its own economy.
you know, and the whole notion of offshore being very onshore, right?
Yeah.
The kind of tax and secrecy jurisdictions, the tax break and secrecy jurisdictions exist, you know, in London, they exist in the United States, they exist in the Netherlands, they exist in these places. They're not necessarily tiny offshore jurisdictions that we need to be dealing with. They're within our own political jurisdiction, right? Where we vote, where we are active, and we need to be, and there are, of course, movements trying to deal with that, but there are also very strong vested interests in maintaining that system. And this goes back to one of the things I was saying before, which is, you know, we like to think of these war zones as far
over there
and over there. And we are there. And it's through these value chains, whether they're financial, weapons, and others, for private security companies, et cetera, we are there.
And that gets back to your earlier point about the neoliberal era and the increasing connection or lack of distinction between the local and the global.
Yeah, exactly. It has been that, you know, it was common in some of the war economies literature 10, 15 years ago, which is tiny, by the way. I don't want to make it sound it's a huge canon or anything, but you know, to talk about globalization as to talk about the globalization dynamics of warfare as being all about privatization, right? We're creating, right, there's the explosion in the 1990s of private military and security companies, for example, right? As a direct result of the drawdown, post-Cold War drawdown in state militaries. I mean, absolutely, very real phenomenon. We're still living with that phenomenon to this day. But the idea that it's all about the private sector, I think is just false. It's
right.
all about the nexus between the state and capital.
Because they can't exist in isolation from each other.
Can't, in particular when you're talking about the use of force, right? When you're talking about these levels of violence, when you're talking about war and dictatorship, it is precisely that nexus that matters. You know, just to go back to the Middle East. I mean, look at what Europe is. You know, we can talk about the U.S. We can talk about Russia in Syria. We can but look what Europe is doing in Libya, right? As part of the whole kind of
Frontex,
Frontex, Fortress Europe, right? The involvement in financing detention centers in Libya, which are being run by
and the EU has effectively, even if informally, outsourced its border control to militias on the Libya's Mediterranean coast.
Yeah. And this whole this of course is one of the major ways in these war economies that states operate, right? It's through proxies. You see this over and over and over and over again, whether it's Turkey in Syria or, you know, US in Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. This pattern plays itself because, of course, that it's the easiest way to have a toe in those waters is by providing financing, weapons, and training, right? So the
value chain increases.
Those three key components, money and the money to buy weapons and fund soldiers.
Mark Taylor, your War Economies and International Law, out this year from Cambridge University Press, has made an extremely valuable contribution to the growing literature on war economies. And I'd like to thank you once again for sharing your time, your expertise, and your insights with Connections.
Thanks, Mouin. Thanks for having me on.